keep all sorts of stuff in it. The other one that a lot of people ask me about is the Weck jars. And the Weck jars are the glass jars with a glass lid that has the wire bail that snaps over. And again, those are not for canning.
Right.
Those are for storage only.
Right.
So, you get a hold of some of those, and they're in all of the kitchen stores. They're on the web. They're on, they're available all sorts of places, but don't use them to can with. Okay?
Yeah. Fun, but not for canning.
I'll see you in the kitchen a little bit later, Stephanie. Thank you. We also need to think about and remember that we have a raw pack and we have a hot pack. A raw pack is what I did when I showed you how to do the peaches, where you just simply take the skins off, you put the product into the jar without any extra cooking. And I find that to be a much more natural way of getting a more firm product like peaches, pears, apple slices, things like that, as compared to things like tomatoes. I quite often use a hot pack. The hot pack is where you actually cook the product in a pot, and then you transfer it to the jar and then process it in the jar. And so that a lot of your tomato products like salsas and spaghetti sauce and those kinds of things are great to do hot pack. And the timing for processing is going to be a whole lot different involved in having that involved. And when we use the hot water bath canner, and Stephanie's going to bring that back to us in a little while, is that we need to make sure that we have a rack in the canner. And I mentioned it earlier that if you have a big stock pot, you can use that as your canner as long as the jars are in the canner and there's at least 1 inch to 2 inches of water above the jar. So it needs to be a very deep stock pot. And then use a heat-resistant plate in the bottom, Corelware, things like that. Turn the plate upside down so that the heat of the direct heat from the bottom of the pot is not going to hit directly on the bottom of the jar to cause the jar to break. Then go ahead and put the jars in, and normally in a regular stock pot you could probably get 4 or maybe 5 jars. You don't want to make them tight because you want to be able to have the heat come around each jar equally. And we don't want to have the canner hang over more than 4 inches beyond the burner. And so you need to use the bigger burner on your stove. Now you need to follow your stovetop directions if you have the flat surface glass top stoves, because some of them will tell you not to use them for canning because it becomes much too hot and you may crack the top of your glass topped stovetop. You need to have a little bit of space, and there is an adapter that will work with some of the glass top stoves that allow you to. It's almost like a little trivet that's heat resistant that you put on top of your stove, and then put the pot on top of that so that there's air around it, and it will allow you not to have your glass top crack. But we need to remember that the hot water boiling water bath is for fruits and high acid foods only. Tomatoes are high acid, but as soon as you start adding onions, peppers, any kind of meats into the sauce, it becomes a low acid food. So you need to be very careful in making sure that the pH level stays on the acid side. So if you're experimenting with some of Grandma's favorite recipes from years ago, it's nice to have litmus paper and actually test your product before you decide whether you're going to do hot water bath or whether you're going to do pressure canner cooking. You need to remember that salt is not necessary in products for hot water bath canning with fruits or vegetables. It used to be that we always added some salt, or there for a while we were even adding aspirin to the top of tomatoes, because when we first introduced the low acid tomatoes, people thought because it was low acid it would be a problem. But we're finding now through research that it's not necessary to add salt or any other kinds of additives to tomatoes. If you like the really bright red tomatoes, you may want to add a little bit of lemon juice just to brighten the color. But again, I'm not real fond of lemon juice because it has a tendency to take the flavor of the fresh tomato away from us. And so this one that was canned last September had nothing added to it, and it's been sitting on my pantry shelf since September of '08, and I've not had a problem with it at all. Sugar syrup, remember you need to check the recipe in your book. Remember not to have any jars that are cracked or chipped, And it's very easy to chip a jar, especially if you're using a can opener to flip the lid off, that you may flip and get a little chip of glass. So if you do, you need to be very careful how you serve that food, because that glass chip may have flipped into the food. Make sure that the rim of the jar is completely clean before you put the canning lid on it. And then also make sure to turn off the heat and let it sit in the canning in the canner for about 5 minutes before you start moving them out. And then that way you'll be sure not to break any of the seals on your jars as you lift them out, using the canning tongs as you lift them out of the canner. And so that if you lift them straight up and then put them normally on several layers of newspaper and a towel to cool, and you want to be able to cool them with distances like this so that you're not having the jars touch each other, and allow them to cool at least 12 hours before you put them away. Cooling them completely is very important, because moving the products while they're still warm could cause them to have a seal partially break, and you won't necessarily notice it. But as Stephanie shared with us earlier, several weeks later, you might find something that has a super science experiment growing in the jar. And so once they have been thoroughly cooled and you've checked to make sure there's no ding-dongs, oops, these two are going to have to go in the refrigerator and be used up immediately. This is canned air. But these then can be ready to go into your pantry. Now people will say, well, where should I store these? And I usually recommend that you store them in an area that's going to be dark and cool, but not freezing. And where the temperature is going to maintain a standard temperature. It's recommended 45 degrees, but most houses don't have a place that's only 45 degrees. So I happen to have a attached garage that maintains its temperature between, in the wintertime, down to 45, and in the summertime up to about 60. So I actually have pantry shelves in my garage in the back corner where it's dark, and I've got doors on my cabinets. And so when I get ready to put them away, I have them on like this. I take the ring off and I wash the ring. And then I wipe off the jar to make sure that if anything had squirted out during processing, or a jar might have broken or anything, so I don't have any extra sticky on the outside. I wash them all in warm soapy water, and then I put them in the pantry like this. I don't leave the rings on, because the rings will most often have particles of food in the creases and rims of the jar, and that's where bacteria can grow and cause rotting food, and it also ruins your rings. And so then these rings can easily be stored and reused. So I wash these, and then we recycle and reuse them again. And when I'm doing canning on a regular basis, I actually use a coat hanger and slide these on my coat hanger. So I have one of largemouth rings, and then I also have a coat hanger with this many rings. But all of these, when I take them off my jar, will be thrown away. Or they can be used for dry things, like if you've got dried fruit or something like that, you can reuse them that way, but you can't reuse them to can with. Even though they may seem like they're okay, please go and buy new lids. They're not that expensive. And so those are some of the safety things that we need to think about when we're talking about water bath canning. And Stephanie, is the kitchen ready with a nice hot pot?
Almost there.
You know, when you watch a kettle boil, it never boils. So we're hoping to be able to show you what it looks like to have a witch's brew in our pot. But it may take us a little while, and we may have to come back to that. When we think about canning, and you're going to see this with each of our segments, is that you need to remember to choose ripe and good-looking fruits and vegetables to can. Can them and freeze them at the peak of their condition, not in the dead of the winter. Follow research-based recipes, and those would be found in your extension bulletins, as well as the paperbacks that I mentioned to you earlier. And then also make sure that in acid foods, you use at least a 1/2 inch headspace. And remember, I told you that comes usually, you don't have to take the measuring stick out, but if you fill your food up to this heavy rim on the jar, that gives you your 1/2 inch headspace, so that there's enough room to create a vacuum when this jar is heated to pull the lid down as the jar is heated through. Many times people will ask me, call me and say, but Sue, we've got half-gallon and 2-quart jars that my grandmother had that I'd like to can in. And I have